Hi everyone, welcome back to Building Publics, Humanities Combating Isolation, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us in such troubling and too many such times. It's greatly appreciated. I hope that everyone is faring well. My name is Maria González Pendas. I'm the coordinator of the Public Humanities Initiative at Columbia University. I am thrilled to welcome all of you to this series, which we had hoped to hold in person, but are excited to now offer as part of the online programming of the SOF Heyman Center for the Humanities. The series, moreover, is part of our commitment here to promote public and civically engaged humanities work and teaching at Columbia, particularly by way of offering graduate students the support and mentoring to expand their scholarship and career prospects. This seminar will feature the fruits of one such effort, the projects developed by our Public Humanities graduate student fellows, some as SOF Heyman Fellows, with whom I've had the great pleasure to work closely for the past year, and some also as Fellows of Humanities New York. An interdisciplinary group of emerging scholars and very brilliant ones, the Fellows have worked both together and independently to implement projects that bridge humanistic thinking with civic engagement and social justice, scholarly research with community building. In this seminar, fellows will present their efforts to promote humanistic thinking beyond the university through a variety of media, such as audio media and podcast producing, walking and mapping, and curatorial and pedagogical practices aimed at serving under-resourced communities. They will also discuss the origins of their projects in a commitment to break out of academic silos and their current thinking about the methods and urgency of the field of public humanities today, amidst the recent foreclosure of the public sphere, but also, and more specific to us, amidst what seems to be the foreclosure of academic futures in higher education. Presentations will be followed by discussion with some guest scholars and community partners, some of whom have been very helpful during the conception of the projects. Today, we continue our conversation started last week on audio as a media critical to reshaping the humanities and social work. Our fellow presenters, again, are Milan Terlunen and Olivia Branscum, who I will introduce again because we have some new guests. Milan is a doctoral student in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, where he studies the history of the plot twist in the 19th century British and French and German literature. Olivia is a doctoral student at the Philosophy Department, working on early modern and medieval thinkers as they explain situations where the boundaries between people, objects, images, written and spoken words blur. Both of them are part of the production team of How to Read, a very successful podcast series featuring literary scholars, of which Milan is a co-creator and a host. And I think Milan will be sending, links to things that we talk about in the chat box as we speak. Together, they joined the SOF Heyman Public Humanities Fellowship with a project that aimed at embedding podcast production in the public and in the city, and they will discuss these ideas, the past of the future of their work, with a presentation on podcast as research. Our guests today include Mary Mies and Emily Bloom, and we're extremely grateful that you have joined us today. Mary Mies requires little introduction, and I will certainly not do her justice with my brief remarks. She's a field-shaping artist in more ways than one, a multi-prize winner and widely exhibited land and installation artist, who has, for over 4 decades, defined new visions of the interactions between the public sphere and the political issues of the times, particularly pertaining environmental justice. She has developed, to name but one, the project City as Living Lab, a framework for making issues of urban life and sustainability tangible and visible through interdisciplinary collaborations in the arts and sciences. And I mentioned this project because it has been a crucial reference for our conversations throughout the year. There are many, many more interesting projects that she's developing at the time. Emily Bloom is a dear friend of the SOF Heyman, a literary scholar. She is the author of the prize-winning book, The Wireless Past, Anglo-Irish Writers at the BBC, which chronicles the emergence of oral media and the British Broadcasting Corporation and as a significant promotional platform and aesthetic influence for Irish modernism. Her current work sits at the intersection of disability and media, and she teaches in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. She was previously Associate Director of the SOF Heyman, where she organized many events, but among others, she put together the conference, The Unplugged Soul, a conference on podcast, which may interest many of you, and I believe is now part of the media archive of the SF Heyman. It will be soon. So Kay, maybe we can also throw the link in the chat box for everyone to look at this conference. And speaking of the chat box, I will summarize the format that we're working in today. We're in a Zoom meeting, so everyone is visible to everyone else, but we ask that you remain muted during the presentation. You can mute your cameras as well during the presentation, but I ask that you turn them on again for the Q&A so that we create a sense of community. After our presenters and guests have had their conversation, we do want to open it up to a Q&A. You can either send your questions and your links on the chat box, but you can also digitally raise your hands, and there is that option. If you open your participants menu, there's an option to digitally raise your hands, and Milan and Olivia will be moderating the discussion and calling you in for the time that we might have. We plan the whole event to last an hour until 5 p.m. So with that, I'm going to pass on the control of the grid to Milan. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Maria, and thanks everyone for coming. It's wonderful to see so many of you. And special thanks to Mary Miss and Emily Bloom. It's great to see both of you again. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about questions of podcasting and of research, and the two in combination, because I know you both have very interesting things to share there. So I think first things first is I need to share my screen. So how do I do that? So hopefully this is now visible to you all. Hit present. Okay. So can I just get some thumbs up to make sure that everyone's seeing this? Yes. Okay, good. So actually, before we get onto this, so I'm just going to introduce a little bit what we're doing and then what's going to happen afterwards. So we're going to talk for about 10-15 minutes about the research methods that we've developed through this podcast. For us, we're defining research as knowledge production. So all the ways in which the podcast that we produce, which is called How to Read, all the ways in which knowledge is produced through that. And overall, there's kind of three ways that we see research playing a role in the podcast. So every episode is an interview with a different scholar talking about their existing research, sometimes work in progress, sometimes things they've published on. So there is always our guests' research. That's kind of obvious in the finished product. And then there's also the research that we do in preparing for these episodes. And so that's going to be the main focus of our presentation now. And then there's a third kind of knowledge production that we also really value, that we're not really able to speak about so much, but it's important, which is that we think of our listeners as producing knowledge when they're actively listening. And so we're also trying to create episodes that really allow listeners to be generating knowledge. But so our focus is going to be on the research that we do in advance of each episode. And we just wanted to give you all some guiding questions for the discussion later on. So after we finish presenting, we're going to hear from Mary and from Emily, but then we'd also love to hear thoughts from all of you about any of the following questions. So questions for scholars interested in public humanities, questions specific to people doing podcasts or interested in creating podcasts, questions for researchers. So I'll leave those up for a minute longer. We'll put them up on the screen again at the end, but these are some of the directions that we would be interested to have the discussion go. So I think with that, I will hand over to Olivia. Do you want to take it up?
Yeah, so we also just wanted to invite you all to contribute any sort of thoughts or questions that you have during the course of our presentation, like in the chat. And we will return to those when we get to our wider discussion after the presentations, but also that can be a format where we can have some discussion happening sort of concurrently with the presentations. So with that, I'm going to, Milan, can you bump us ahead to the next slide? Great. So one of the first things that we do as we're preparing to record new episodes is return to and add to a database that we have, which contains a bunch of information about potential guests. You can see from the screenshot here on the slides sort of what that information consists of. We try to keep track of how often we've contacted people, sort of what the next steps will be, and also a bit about folks' research areas, any sort of pertinent information about the time periods that they're working in, the disciplines that they're working in. But what we really want to highlight about the potential guest database is that it allows us, it's a method that we've adopted as the podcast has grown that allows us to, we think, sort of keep tabs on what for us is a sweet spot that we try to hit with every episode. Namely, it's a synthesis of what people in academia have been doing lately. So it's like kind of up-to-date, relevant research that academics will find interesting, but that also will connect with the lives of people outside of academia. And this is a place where our undergraduate producers can be really invaluable. I think that one of our undergrad producers is actually here with us, Sam Wilcox. But anyway, we might hear from Sam on this topic or another one a bit later. But we find that our undergrad producers are really helpful in the sort of pre-research stage, the stage that I'm talking about right now, because as undergrads, obviously, they're involved in academic institutions, but they're also not yet sort of en route to professionalization as academics. So we feel like in our conversations with them, we're able to get a good sense of like, what are the topics that would be landing in that sort of overlap? For example, Sam and our other undergraduate producer, Colby, have raised points like, you know, intersectionality would be really interesting. Maybe we could talk about the Anthropocene. You know, these are things that are on our radars as well, but that can be really highlighted by the contributions of our undergraduates. So once we have reached out to people who are on the database and sort of narrowed down some folks that we'd like to talk to, the next step in our research process before we get to the recording stage is the pre-interview. Milan, do you want to take over and discuss that a little bit?
Yeah. So the pre-interview is a sort of a practice that we've developed over the years as a way to really ensure that by the time we come to record, we can produce really like excellent focused conversations, that the guest knows what to expect, that we know what to expect from the guest. And so the one thing that I really wanted to highlight here is, so this is a screenshot of part of our pre-interview template. So for each specific guest, we will adapt this to whatever that topic is and sometimes add further questions. But we've refined this template over the years so that actually we can just like go in almost cold with a guest and still very quickly get to the heart of the topic that they're interested in and try and figure out ways that it's going to speak to people outside of academia and what they're able in a really kind of effective way to explain from first principles, so without assuming any kind of prior knowledge of a specific academic discipline or of a specific work of art or work of literature. So these are some of the questions that we have in our template. And yeah, there are other things that we do in the pre-interview, you know, to do with sort of just in conversation with a guest, like what are their strengths? Are there any things that they're kind of uncomfortable to talk about? We want to know that as early as possible so that, you know, when we come to record, we're actually really working with them as well as possible. And I think that's all that I want to say about the pre-interview for now. If that everything? Okay, so then, Olivia, do you want to talk about planning the interview and preparing the guest?
Yeah, so both the pre-interview and this next phase of research, the interview planning and guest preparation, sort of are all about like threading the needle between like being prepared and setting us up to sound sort of canned. Like we don't want to sound canned. We want to sound unrehearsed if possible. We want the conversation to be fresh, and we want to have a feeling when we get to the actual recorded interview. Ideally, our guests will feel this way, Milan will feel this way, and our listeners will also pick up on this, that, you know, new ideas or sort of new insights into existing ideas are being sort of figured out as we go. So, you know, of course, it takes a lot of planning to make that possible, but it's also possible to kind of go too far. So when we're doing the interview plan, we like to think through sort of what we anticipate being kind of the narrative arc of what the conversation will be. So typically this ends up taking 3 parts. We like to think of the conversation in terms of like a first example, a second example, and then sort of a big picture takeaway or kind of portable conceptual tool that our listeners will then be able to apply to other situations. But in an effort to not sound like overly rehearsed, we avoid planning out specific questions in too much detail. We'll think about particular topics that we could bring up, often based on stuff that comes up in the pre-interview conversation. So in the last slide, you might have noticed we have sort of a section where we ask people, you know, have you ever talked to your family members about this topic? You know, what were their reactions? If, for instance, somebody had a fun anecdote about, you know, their niece or nephew or some family member learning about the area of research that they're going to be talking about in the interview, we might know to go ahead and ask about that, and that it could be something that could take us into an interesting direction. But we don't have like a list of questions that we rely on. And this also means that you know, sometimes guests will reach out asking for a list of questions prior to the interview itself. And we don't even have that for our own purposes to offer them. So we just typically will say, here's an overview of the topics we anticipate discussing, and this is our sort of working title for the episode, but we don't give specific questions in advance. And I think one of the most sort of relevant elements of this part of our process to the 3 kinds of research that Milan flagged at the beginning of the presentation is the idea of the portable concept, which I just mentioned. So we hope that our listeners will take away from episodes a tool or concept that, like I said, they can apply to other areas of their life or other topics that are of interest to them. And we never know in advance exactly what that's going to be. So part of what the interview pre-planning process entails is thinking about like, well, what are a few different directions we could see the conversation heading in that would set our listeners up for an interesting big picture takeaway. But we really like to allow the conversation to unfold in the moment and sort of organically lead Milan and the guest to a conclusion like that. But you can see here on the sort of screenshot that's on the slides, we have a number of different things that we might talk about in the big picture section. When it comes to the final edit, maybe only one of those will be presented. And then we always like to conclude with some fun questions. Almost all of our interviews have, or almost all of our final edited episodes will include at least one of those in the final cut. But it's a fun way to sort of bring things back down to earth a little bit. And it also allows listeners to relate to guests, which is something that's a really big goal of ours. So I think that covers the main points about interview planning. I guess just to sort of be a bit more clear, I think that the big picture element of the planning is really important because it contributes to the possibility of listeners being engaged in knowledge production of their own as they're actively listening along with us. And that's really important to us. I would say it's like one of sort of the core mission elements of what we do with the podcast. So Milan, is there anything else that you want to cover on that topic?
No, I mean, I think it connects to some of the things I want to say for the next sections, but no, I think you've covered it. So then, knowledge production during the interview. So here is a pitch from one of our interviews. Julie Crawford herself is here, so yeah, I hope you feel okay with that. I should have probably asked in advance. So given that we're talking about research as knowledge production, we also felt it was important to kind of emphasize that there's all this research that goes into preparing for an interview, but then the interview itself is also knowledge production. And so some of the ways that I think of my role in the interview is, firstly, like as someone in literary studies, like the technique of close reading is one that you know, is sort of constant in our discipline. And I mean, if I just quickly jump back to the previous slide, like under section 2, like we've got examples. In general, like when we're talking about a specific example, I will just kind of keep asking questions to try and really kind of collectively produce a close reading of a particular literary work, a particular work of art, a particular historical event. So that's one way in which I think not planning, but just being responsive to what the guest is sharing works well for us and actually allows us to maybe make observations or claims about this specific topic that that just kind of go into more detail or go in unexpected directions compared to what the guest has written about before. The other way that I think about this is, so when I was an undergrad, I trained with Nightline, which is a sort of listening and support service over the phone. And one of their key ideas is this concept of non-directionality. So how you can like keep a conversation going over the phone without directing it in any way. So you're not being directional, you're just every time whatever the person says, responding to that using their terms, not introducing language of your own, not introducing kind of statements of your own. And so again, that's a way in which I think actually that too leads to a kind of knowledge production in which just by echoing back in thoughtful ways the terms and the ideas of the guest, it leads to new ways of thinking about that topic for them. And for me, the most like satisfying examples of that is when a guest actually pauses and says like, I hadn't quite thought about it that way, but now that you mention it, yes, and that would, you know, so that kind of thinking out loud, when that happens in the interview, I love that. I feel very satisfied, but also that's the type of thing that we love to leave in because it is also signaling to listeners like, hey, you can also be thinking out loud here and there's like new ideas in the process of being developed. So yeah, I think I will leave it there in terms of knowledge production during the interview. Olivia, is there anything else that you want to add there?
I guess just that.
Oh, you should talk about your role.
Yeah, so another strategy that we've developed for interview recording sessions is at the same time as Milan is applying those literary studies close reading skills, I'm applying some of my philosophical training by thinking, okay, we've introduced this concept. Have we explained what the concept is? Are we clear about what our definitions are? Is there anything that we need to make sure is rounded out or concluded or followed up on so that listeners will be able to follow the line of argument? And often I'll just sort of keep track of any times that things get brought up but not really concluded, or, you know, we might want to define something just for people who aren't experts. And at the end of the interview, sometimes I'll ask, you know, Milan to pose another question, just kind of organically build up conversation around the argument in question, or sometimes I'll just ask our guest or Milan to define a term that they mentioned, or say, you know, first and last name of a really well-known figure in a particular field, so that people who aren't in that field will be able to feel like they have their bearings. So it's really, I think, been useful for us to be able to sort of apply the disciplinary specific training that we each have in trying to make the interviews as enriching and like clear conversations as possible, once again with the ultimate goal of creating products that will allow the listeners to produce knowledge alongside us as they are listening to the final edit.
Yeah, I mean, we feel it's quite a like efficient division of labor that like, because I'm sort of in this like non-directional mode, like I'm not particularly thinking far back or far ahead. I'm just listening very intensely to what's being said and trying to kind of think of what my next response is going to be. And then Olivia is there really listening for kind of what's actually been recorded on the audio, what's been defined or hasn't been defined, where are the kind of missing links and ideas that need to be fleshed out. So, you know, when it works well, we get both of those sides.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to wrap up our presentation here. I just want to reiterate that for this particular presentation of the ways that How to Read is engaging in research, we want to focus on how our work with the podcast has allowed us to really refine a set of methodologies that we see as a kind of knowledge production. So specifically, you know, we talked about the potential guest database that we have. We talked about our pre-interview template that we use, the interview prep strategies that we use, and then also just the sort of strategies behind the scenes, tricks and tools that we use during the interviews themselves, all of which are methods that we've worked out through trial and error. And we hope that the research we're doing in developing these methods could be significant to other kinds of public humanities projects as well. Podcasts certainly, but not limited to podcast or audio media projects. You know, insofar as all public humanities projects are aiming at communicating humanistic ideas to a broader public, these strategies for refining communication could be useful to them. So with that in mind, we want to return to the guiding questions that we started out our presentation with. So for public humanists, which, you know, you might think podcasters always are public humanists and researchers often are. So of course there's overlap between these categories, but a question that we think is really important coming out of thinking about the work we do as research in this specific way is how can you best research the public that you want to engage? And what do you need to know and what methods do you have or do you need to develop to research the public that you want to engage and also to be able to reach them more effectively? For podcasters, what knowledge are you producing in the finished episodes and also behind the scenes? And how can you make that knowledge more valuable or maybe even visible to yourself and also to others who may want to make podcasts of their own, or, you know, I could see it being valuable to people who are trying to be podcasters too. And then for researchers, what do you consider to be the benefits or challenges of presenting your work through a podcast? And what could podcasters do to make this more appealing? So we have presentations from Emily Bloom and Mary Miss next, but if anyone wants to speak to these questions in the wider discussion at the conclusion of the presentations or in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. So is there anything else, Milan, that we want to say before we turn the floor over?
I think, yeah, just to reiterate, like, it would be really helpful to us if you could put some comments, reactions in the chat now, and then once we've heard from Mary and from Emily, then we can kind of know who has something to share and invite you to elaborate on that. So yeah, if you've sparked any ideas for you, then please share them through the chat. So Mary, are you ready to talk next?
You know, I didn't speak with you ahead of time, so I'm not sure exactly the role that you were imagining for me, but you know,
Well, shall we tell people a little bit about the previous meeting that we had?
yes, please.
So Maria put me and Olivia in touch with Mary Miss, who, along with her team, has been organizing these City as Living Lab walks, and Mary is definitely more qualified to talk about that than us, but they have also been thinking about potentially using audio recordings of those walks and creating podcast content out of that. And so I'm curious to hear whether you've got any further with that, but also just, yeah, we're curious, like from your perspective as someone who's really doing very like out in the world active public humanities projects and also public science, what do you see as the value of podcasting?
Well, I really it was so interesting to have a chance to, you know, start a conversation with you when you came to the studio. And we've done one podcast since then and realized that it takes a lot of work to do this, but definitely think that it's worth it. And I think, you know, there is this whole series of walks that we've done and videotaped over the past decade while we've been particularly exploring Broadway. And there have been such interesting things that surfaced in those walks, whether things noticed by people from the area that we were walking, or the maybe scientist or sociologist who was walking with us, or the artist. But if you go back and look at those videos, they're very distant. They're very much like watching a lecture that somebody is giving in a way. There is no intimacy to them. And I think that's what is so appealing to us about, and obviously to a lot of people, because podcasts have really become such a popular thing. So I think we would love to be able to investigate this further, and we were really happy with the kind of dialogue that developed between the artist Nicholas Estevez and the ecologist John Butler. This conversation, two very different characters, one coming almost you know, from a spiritual background, to this guy who's a hard-nosed scientist who wants to count how many critters are, you know, in the water. And it was really quite, I really liked the contrast. But the other thing that is so appealing to me is this thing, you know, how does knowledge become integrated into the world? And it's what we're always talking about and trying to understand. We've had some really interesting exchanges with various scientists and others. Particularly recently, we've been working in Chinatown on food systems, and there's a scholar who's written a book about the food systems in Chinatown, and they really offer a very compelling alternative to food supplies, the way food supplies happen in cities usually, that it's neither the high-end farmers market at Union Square or Hunts Point. And, you know, we ended up with this conversation with a farmer from Florida, a cookbook author, a community activist, the scholar, and we had about 20 people. And it was, you know, there were all these different levels of exchange that were beginning to be able to happen, and that will really hopefully end up to be something that can be supportive and helpful to this struggling community that's just been hit time and again, especially right now. And so that's the interest to me of podcasts, that larger picture of how research, information, whether it's scientific research or you know, how can we allow people to join in on reflecting on the world around us in ways that maybe they aren't called upon often. And you know, to go back up to Tibbetts Brook and talk about the project where we're trying to daylight a stream, my fantasy is that we could have podcasts that people could listen to as they were on these 7 bridges that cross the future stream corridor, and hear people talking about what could be there that won't be there for another 10 or maybe 20 years now, that because of the current crisis taking all the money out of everything. How could we keep people engaged with imagining that future? So I just see it as such a wonderful bridge, you know, that can help accomplish the things that you're talking about.
Can I just add before we move on to Emily? I think this was a wonderful summary, Mary, of some of the things that Milan and Olivia had not had a chance to sort of explore, because you've given us such a sort of detail and very, very helpful sort of layout of your research process. But the challenge that you were moving on towards, which is to locate the podcast in a specific public and in the specific city. And the challenges, you know, as much as you had your process very well laid out, the moment you started thinking some of these issues that Mary was asking us to think about, like how do you bring the podcast from the oral wireless media that Emily writes about to the specific of a time and place and the specific of the city, and make it a medium to unleash the imagination of the city, as Mary's talking about. And that opened up a whole new set of challenges, both technical, but also public or scholarly, on how to establish that conversation, no? Because it becomes an embedded, placed a specific way of producing knowledge. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done collaboratively and technically on bridging that challenge in the ways that Mary just asked us to do. I'm sure that Emily has a lot to say about these.
Yes, this is really wonderful. Thanks for inviting me to come talk with you. One of the things that I loved about your description of your process was you spent a lot of time talking about the relationship between the pre-interview and the interview, and like how you actually create a sense of informality and authenticity. You guys have this wonderful tagline on your website, which is, "We like academics who can talk like real people." And I was really interested when I read that and sort of how you cultivate a sense of realness. And you did a great job showing how you go about doing that. So it definitely made me think of some early radio history and thinking about the sort of rise of the interview format in general as a way of creating a sense of personal connection and getting past this idea of a remote figurehead kind of speaking at you. So in early radio, Hilda Matheson, who was involved with Bloomsbury, was one of the first proponents of this sort of informal style that we now, you know, sort of associate with radio and podcasting. And I love the way that you described how you kind of cultivate that, because it feels like in some ways to get the authentic, you need a certain degree of artifice, a certain degree of cultivation. And that came through very clearly. With early radio, it was all pre-scripted, all the interviews, down to the word, down to the like informal asides were all pre-scripted. So you guys have a much more flexible model, which really shows in the final product. So I did have a couple follow-up questions, sort of going off of what Mary Miss was talking about and the idea of audience, especially right now, right? You know, we're all kind of speaking into voids, and I think we feel it a lot at this moment, not being able to have that audience interaction, not being able to talk to people, not being able to even like see facial expressions, how people are responding to you. And this is something that I find in early radio history is a real anxiety about audience. One of the early radio books by a BBC producer was called Who's Listening? And I think that you often feel that sense of like, who is listening to a podcast? Who is listening to this kind of new media endeavor, especially in the public humanities, right? Especially when you think of your audience as both an academic audience and a public audience, a sort of broader audience. So I was just curious sort of how you cultivate an audience, but also how you gauge audience response. What is it that you're looking for when you're trying to understand your listener as producers of knowledge? When have they produced knowledge and how do you know it? So I'm just kind of curious about your engagement with your audience, and if you're satisfied right now with how you engage with your audience, if you're thinking about new ways of doing that. And then the other thing, so I'm throwing a lot of questions at you, but I don't want to take up too much time because I know a lot of people have questions. But the other thing that, just as someone who studies early radio, is there's often this kind of tension that I found between the intimacy of the address, the ways in which, you listen to radio or podcasts at home, now more than ever at home. It used to be you listened to them walking, and you listened to them at the grocery store and public spaces. So there was always this drive to speak to people in a way that's soft and comforting and non-threatening. And at the same time, in the public humanities, we do have this desire to push people out of their comfort zone, to make people think about the world differently. Certain kind of provocation, I think, is often in order. So I was just curious how you guys try and balance, if you see that as a tension between intimacy and challenging material, and if that's something you guys have thought about, and what are your strategies for sort of dealing with that tension?
That's really, really interesting. And I think that there's a lot we could say about it. But one thing that comes to mind for me is like, we don't talk so much about in the language of intimacy, but we do talk a lot about accessibility. And sort of, I wonder, I think those are definitely related concepts. And I think one way in which they're related is, they have to do with sort of meeting somebody where they're at and trying to make content that people feel they can tune into sort of whenever works for them. But then the flip side of accessibility is also the reason it's so desirable is precisely because it allows us to make complex, challenging ideas more legible perhaps to listeners. And I think one assumption that I certainly have working on the podcast is that, our listeners are already interested in these complex ideas. Like they already care about challenging things, or learning sort of challenging things, or expanding their perspectives, I guess. And the way I like to think about it is like, how can we just fill a perceived gap that might exist between the kind of research that happens in sort of academic institutions and people outside of academic institutions who already care about that kind of knowledge production. So I guess for me, if we think about intimacy in terms of accessibility, I actually sort of see them as working together. But I don't know, Milan, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, what I would say is, I don't think we really talk about like intimacy, but I think a word that we use a lot is personality. And, we want our guests' personalities to shine through, and often we'll, leave certain bits of audio in, even if they're not particularly remarkable for content, if there's a kind of real sense of the guest personality. And I think that for us, there's sometimes, or for me, maybe especially, there's a tension between how much of my personality we want to come through in the final episode, because ultimately it's not about me. And, in some ways I'm trying to be a kind of stand-in for any listener, which raises that difficult question of like, who is our audience? What does it mean to be a stand-in for anyone? But also we want it to feel like warm and friendly and personal. So I think, that question of how much of my personality as a host to have in the finished product, I think that's often where that tension comes in. And just on, do you want to go?
Well, I think this is an interesting thought, and I was wondering what Mary Miss might think about it. Not this presumption of the sort of distance listener, or the everyone listener that you're talking about, versus acquiring a more, a role on curating a conversation with a more specific political, scholarly, or public project. No, Mary, you were talking about putting different people together. So there's a very specific agency that you have in choosing who you talk to, what do you talk about, and then here sort of summarizing some of the questions that are coming on the chat box. If you were able to talk a little bit about, who you choose to interview, how much reading do you choose to make, and what type of reading do you prepare before the interview? And talking about these things sort of forces you in a way to move away from that position of like the everybody listener and take your agency as someone who is curating a very specific conversation that creates an intimacy between very specific, yourself and the interviewer. When you go into the public, the city, and you start introducing more than one interview, and it's like 3 or 4, that sort of, I think it puts you in a slightly different position of creating that intimacy that the one that you're talking about. So perhaps it's something that is coming with the territory of moving the podcast in new directions, as you're doing with the sort of public humanities project.
Yeah. So is this a moment to sort of invite other people in? And in particular, so I know there are some former guests of the podcast here, and we're really kind of fascinated to hear what your experiences have been, both recording these podcasts, maybe listening back to them, how other people have engaged with your work through that podcast episode. And also, so one of our undergrad producers, Sam, is here. So Sam, if you also want to add anything about your experiences of doing research for this podcast, maybe we could start with some of those contributions. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind turning video on so we can see who we're talking with.
I would really love to hear from Sam if Sam's up for speaking, but I would also second Nick James's question about, and I really mean this non-cynically, but about how you guys decide how much of the work or even like website of the people you decide to interview you're reading. And why I say non-cynically, because I think this is something we're often doing. There's people I've worked with for 20 years where I don't really know anything about their research.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sam could also potentially speak to this, but we tend to, we're certainly not reading a scholar's entire body of work. And for us, I think there's 2 kind of very enabling things that we keep in mind. Like, one is that we're ultimately aiming for a 15-minute episode. So even to read like 3 pages of a work of scholarship would probably be more content than you could fit into 15 minutes. So that's not a particularly good use of our time. And then the other thing is that, like, especially for me, trying to be a stand-in for people with no prior knowledge, in some ways, like, the less detail I know, the better. But yeah, I mean, Olivia, do you also want to speak to that, like the ways that we kind of selectively read?
Yeah, I mean, I think one specific way that our reading in advance, this doesn't necessarily directly answer the question about like how much reading we do in advance, but it is sort of how we use the reading that we do. It's like very useful for examples, and often we'll look through, we'll read parts of somebody's most recent publication on the topic that we're talking about, and then be able to raise organically in the course of the conversation an example that they've thought a lot about, without, it allows us to sort of know in advance like which examples the guest is like particularly prepared to discuss. But I know we only have a few minutes left before people might need to start signing off. So Yeah, Sam, are you interested in chiming in? Is that okay?
I can only speak to, I think, in terms of thinking about the research of potential guests, I know from my experience, because my time at the university is very different than I think a lot of other people's, and the sort of temporal, like I mean, I'm no longer an undergraduate, so I'm on my way out, and I think when I think about people I'd like to listen to speak, it's often professors that I'd never maybe had an opportunity to take a class with, or people who I know have taken classes with certain academics, and I'm quite jealous of them. And I think sort of listening to the syllabus or some of the things that come up in a course will sort of inform what I want when I listen to the podcast.
Yeah, I think in a way like that kind of curiosity of an undergrad who knows that there are these interesting people with interesting ideas, that for us has been such a valuable thing, because I think we're just at a slightly later phase of the process. But, you know, to go back to that question of who is our audience, we're not creating this exclusively for undergrads, but often like a curious undergrad is someone that we have in mind as a potential listener and wanting to make sure that it speaks to them, is accessible to them.
I guess, Milan, and again, to summarize some of the questions, we're going to have to be wrapping up soon, but going into the public humanities dimension of it, it would be, you know, when you go outside of the university, even outside of the undergrad population, no? And your interviews are not scholars, but, you know, you're looking to make connections in the city about pressing issues of the city or of whichever public, then how does that change your position as a podcaster, as Olivia says, in having to curate a specific challenges and questions and issues that pertain to those publics?
Yeah, and I mean, the Public Humanities Fellowship has been so valuable for us in thinking about, as we've developed this new project that we hope will happen at some time, where we want to interview a scholar on questions of religion, race and sexuality while walking between different churches in Harlem. As and when that happens, there's absolutely, like, a lot of these questions will change. We'll have different audiences in mind. So yeah, we haven't done that yet, but we know that's coming.
Could I say something? The thing that I would be thinking about is if you do want to take ideas to a particular audience, as you're describing now, I think the thing that's most important is having multiple access points over time, multiple conversations, so it's not going from, you know, hydrology to the history of such and such, you know, but although it might, I guess, but that, you know, that people can get used to the format and to listening and to, you know, hearing very different perspectives on a particular topic or area. So it seems like time is not only the time of the interview, but the ability to do multiple approaches with a community.
Well, in the spirit of the multiple approaches to the community, I have to say that this was a wonderful, quite active conversation of the ones that I've had in Zoom. And it's just the starting point, we hope, to many more conversations and connections that might have been made between people here in the grid to continue some of these conversations, so that this is not being a void that we've been speaking into, Emily, but that we have really created some content and sort of a space to continue some of these conversations. So it's my time to adjourn. I am gonna share my screen. We do have quite a bit of conversation that has been going on in the chat box. And Milan and Olivia will take on that and might get back to you with some of those questions in the future. Thank you so much for contributing to this. I thank you, Milan, Olivia, Mary, and Emily, for your contributions today, and to much more to come. I now invite you to our panel next week, same time on Wednesday, and which will feature Scott McFarlane and Wright Kennedy. Scott also has been in conversation with Mary Meese in developing his environmental mapping project as a form of sort of urban walking. And it's interesting, I mean, we've had to divide these panels for each of the fellows to discuss, but we've talked a lot about also of the possibility of putting all of this media together, no? So what happens when you develop a podcast as you're developing a mapping project, no, of the city, and how would those two come together in a new form of knowledge production, for instance. So next week on walking, mapping, and reimagining the environment, I look forward to seeing you all next week, again with the same link. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here, especially Milan, Olivia, Mary Meese, a silent clapping from us all.